Welcome to the Drumming Research Lab. I'm Pascale Haag. I'm a researcher at the School for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences in Paris. And what you're about to hear is an excerpt from a research seminar with Marcus Smith, Professor of Applied Sport and Exercise Science at the University of Chichester and co-founder of the Clem Burke Drumming Project. In this video, Marcus takes us inside the data, what happens physically during drumming performance, and what can be done by professional drummers to stay in peak conditions and improve their performance. Let me know in the comments if anything surprises you, and if you're a drummer, feel free to share your tips for staying on top form during tours.
So what I'm trying to do is to understand from a physical perspective the demands of drumming. And so you can see in the image that Clem's got like a mask on his face. And one of the areas of work that Professor Steve Draper really led on was looking at oxygen kinetics, the way in which we use oxygen to satisfy the demand for muscular activity. And so the model, I'd done all this with Olympic boxers, and this is the model that's now coming across to the drummer. And I'll touch more about that as we work our way through. So back to that picture, and it's like, so what do you look at? If you've never sat next to a drummer or watched them play, you know, is it the posture? We talked about that a little bit before. Is it the arms, and you're naturally drawn? You know, again, one of my directed tasks for you to do is go and just put any band on playing live, just focus on the drummer, and what you'll appreciate is what they're doing with their arms. What's often missing, what's hidden, is what they're doing with their legs. And so in terms of the larger muscles of the legs, the more leg work you potentially do, the greater the demand for blood that is carrying oxygen to supply and meet that demand. So you begin to get a feel for what it is you're looking at. So my model, imagine that that's a boxer in the middle rather than Clem jumping over his kit. But I wanted to know what sort of training drummers did in preparation for going on tour, which was drumming specific and which was non-drumming. And that's where you get into this notion of supplementary training, whether that's in the gym, running, whatever that may be. The fact that they're on the road for so long, and the fact that they'll be performing late into the evening often, they almost become night workers, and then they're traveling overnight on a bus. So when do you eat? When do you sleep? How do you recover? All of these issues are related to fatigue on the right-hand side in the red box. On top of that, how much do you drink? When do you drink? What do you drink? They're performing often under lights or where it's extremely hot. And I'll show you some data where their sweat rates are equivalent to elite Olympic endurance athletes. That is mind-blowing. So you've got people who you see on TV running at the Olympics, 10,000 meters or the marathon. They have very similar sweat rates to those individuals. And if you don't put the fluid back in, the engine is going to go boom. So there's work around that area. And then if you take the left-hand side of the screen as I'm looking at with the number of performances, how often do they perform? Do they do multiple sets in the day? Do they, how many per week? How many per month? Does it last for a year? In terms of the intensity of the effort, there are ways in which we can use terms such as aerobic, which is sort of steady state work, and anaerobic, which allows us to look at high intensity activity. And again, the type of player, the type of song they're looking to play will dictate how intense that effort is. How long an effort? Is it a 3-minute punk rock song? Or is it a 5, 6, 7-minute disco song? Again, that can have an effect upon where the energy comes from. And a key thing is, how do you recover? So these questions arose from my PhD, and these questions then was what we started to try and unpick with Clem as the professional drummer and other drummers that volunteered their services at the appropriate time. So I'll just quickly show you some data. So the anaerobic side, as I mentioned, reflects high intensity performance. And as we sit in here at rest, you have a value of around about 1 unit. if you take a blood sample immediately after they finish, so this is Clem up at Liverpool after a Blondie gig, you know, his value at the bottom is about 5.9, which shows that because that number has increased, there must have been some anaerobic contribution to that particular performance, which makes sense. We have had values up to about 10. And so if you think, if I put you on a treadmill and ran you to exhaustion, that's typically the sorts of numbers, the 8s, 9s, 10s that you would see from somebody who'd run themselves into the ground. So we can begin to appreciate that there is this anaerobic contribution to performance. The first set of data that I presented, or that's out there from the work with Clem, came in this book by Alan Metz called Blondie, From Punk to the Present, A Pictorial History. And in there, I talk about the study that we did in 1999. And that's just to demonstrate that when we look at someone's heart rate, so your heart rate while you're listening to this particular presentation, maybe around 60, 70, 80 beats per minute. If we think, let's take an abstract number of around about, say, 190 to 200 beats per minute being your maximum, we know that the heart can respond to the demand that is placed upon it for oxygen. So if we're seeing high values, we know potentially that there is a big aerobic requirement to suck air in. That's why we breathe more frequently, we breathe deeper, and our heart rate goes up. It's trying to load the red blood cells with oxygen and take it around the body for that to be used. And so this was the first example of looking at Clem's heart rate and seeing that he's up into the 170s. And I'll show you some data in a minute where he goes up into the 180s, which demonstrates there is a big requirement for us to utilize oxygen when we're playing live. So this is a particular trace from one gig in 2004, where if you look at the figure, you can see time along the bottom, which gives us our sort of 90-minute set. And the red line then denotes heart rate, which is on the left-hand side, the heart rate in response to walking on stage. And then there are particular songs that we've got peak heart rates that reflect how hard Clem was working related to those particular songs. And some of them you might be familiar with: Union City Blue, 191 beats per minute, Heart of Glass, 184. You know, these are big requirements for oxygen. And so that is really, really interesting, because until you collect the data, you've got no idea in terms of the band that someone plays in, the demands of the particular songs that they're asked to play, the order of the songs. It's quite fascinating. We could spend a whole session just analyzing that particular slide. But just to show the images on the left-hand side is the heart rate strap goes around your chest, and it transmits every 5 seconds your heart rate to a watch, a receiver that looks like a digital watch. And we basically download, a bit like a Fitbit or an Apple Watch. You can now get these traces relatively quickly. But for me, as an applied practitioner, it is so useful to understand what's going on in live performance, because what you do in rehearsal is very different than what you potentially do in a live performance. So Clem's heart has to be capable of reaching and sustaining these requirements, because that's what the set demands. And so for me, it's really interesting looking at actual data, collecting the data. And this was the comparison.
Sorry, have you ever collected data from any other drummer than Clem Burke?
Yeah, loads. Yeah, lots. Again, a project, Simon Delarue, that Professor Steve Draper, I'll come across that in a minute. We studied about 18 drummers for that particular study. Yeah, we've done lots and lots. And what's of interest is, again, I'll show you another a drummer. It's very much linked to the band, the type of band.
Yeah, so I was wondering, I can imagine a jazz band would be very different. It's not the same type of energy or the same type of demand.
It's interesting in terms of the perception is that jazz isn't demanding, but I'll show you some evidence again that might, and again, we can pick this up in the Q&A. There are better people.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean it wasn't demanding. It's very demanding, but not the same type of performance. So.
Absolutely not. And thrash metal and all that sort of stuff, you know, all I'm saying is that what the data is demonstrating to us is that there is a physical demand for, in order for you to perform the way that you want to perform, you have to prepare yourself. So just hoping that you're going to do it, you might do it once or partially, but you're doing this 100, 200 times a year. So, you know, you have to prepare yourself for what's going to come. So you can imagine the conversations Clem was really, really interested in. So how do I train for this? And again, maybe we can pick that up a little bit later on. But the concept is about sitting, watching him play, thinking that looks really demanding to me. How can science provide us some insight into the data, the requirements and the demand for him, that we can have a meaningful conversation around this slide? And I can say to Clem, look, you know, this is the reason in training why you need to take your heart rate up to 170, 180 beats per minute, because that's what's going to be expected of it to perform when you're sitting behind your kit playing live. So it makes it far more meaningful to Clem about why he would want to gather this data. And that's, again, we did some really interesting stuff with Cat Myers, with Texas, looking at the effect of an audience. An audience, when they did the hometown gig in Glasgow, was very different to an audience in Bournemouth. Just they played the same set, but it was a different adrenaline-fueled audience, and so the artists bounce off the crowd often that they're with. So it's just fascinating. As I say, I could spend hours discussing just that one slide, but perhaps we can again pick it up with the Q&A afterwards. So this was the analysis of a Premier League footballer on the top to Clem's heart rate trace that the press sort of ran with back in 2008. And at the top, basically, if you work your way across, you can see a block of activity. In the middle is half time, where the heart rate drops down when they're recovering. And then you can see the response to different sprinting and activities within that particular game of football. And then you look at Clem's, this intermittent nature, relating to the tempo and the demands of each of the songs. So the point that we was trying to make, therefore, is that the drummer has to be prepared in the same way that the elite footballer needs to be prepared. So does the drummer. If you look at the E of Blondie, you'll see that there is a sharp decline in the heart rate response. And I'll give you 10 seconds to write down why you think Clem's heart rate dropped at that particular point. And if, Pascale, you gave out golden awards, anyone who comes up with the right answer, will give them a golden reward at the end of the presentation. So why do you think we see that massive reduction in heart rate during the set? And the answer is guitar solo. So Clem just sits and lets the guitarist have their moment. And so because you've taken that demand, the physical demand of him to play away, the heart rate drops. And the rate at which it drops is an indication of fitness. So for me, looking at that part of the whole 90 minutes tells me a lot about how efficient Clem's heart was, because you see a rapid fall in it. Again, we can return to that later on. So the point again, so in 2008, this was taken at the launch with Steve and Clem, is that you can think, God, aren't we clever doing all of this sort of science? And then you go back in history, and this was taken from a paper in 1924, doing exactly the same thing. And you go, oh my gosh, so we're not that clever after all anyway. So we have, Steve and myself had a bit of a chuckle to this. But what's really interesting is that the compendium of physiological load of energy expenditure since 1924 all the way through till the work that we produced was based upon data linked to the energy demands of a drummer playing like this, sort of classical work. Rock and roll hadn't even been invented until the pioneers came along a little bit in the 50s. So all of that data that was still being kicked out for the energy expenditure of musicians for today was based upon a false premise. And so what's really cool when you're doing your own data collection is you can correct, or you can modernize the actual energy expenditure. But the concept, you know, we weren't the first to think of doing it that way. So yeah, it's just really interesting, again, for us to go back always to look at the starting point. We've got better technology, more portable technology, but the concept is still the same. But what this does allow us to do, and again, Steve is an expert within this particular area, is looking at the kinetics, looking at the oxygen demands of different activity. So for us to measure energy expenditure, basically what we did with Clem, we had a heart rate monitor on him, which I showed you previously. He's got this breath by breath gas analyzer analysis system that allows us to quantify how much oxygen has been used. And basically then we developed a test whereby, using the click track by the earphones, we turned it up for him to play at 110, 130, 150, 170 and 190 beats per minute for 4 minutes. It's a bit like going on a treadmill and you're being asked to run faster and faster and faster and faster till you can't play anymore. And so that was our way of looking at a drumming specific test to exhaustion. And again, some of that data will be in the papers that you can look up outside of this particular presentation. So if we understand how big the engine has to be through the measurements that we take, we can then modify training to make sure that that's an appropriate stimulus to get the response that we're after. And that's the paper by Simon Delarue, the Steve's name on it, Chris Potter and myself. And again, that's freely available if people are interested in looking at the energy demands of rock pop drumming. And on the right-hand side, these metabolic equivalents, the MET value, just shows at the bottom that drumming from these 14 semi-professional drummers does show that it is a demanding aerobic activity that has significant energy expenditure. And if we think about it, the link then between nutrition and replacing the energy that we burnt off is really important. So it's well above light intensity, moderate, or even vigorous intensity activities. The drumming can be this useful physiological intervention, especially for potentially health-related issues whereby people want to become more fitter. It's a seated exercise. It's a safe exercise. But that paper's out there, and Pascale, that might answer the question a little bit about the range of different drummers that we've used so far, or not used, we've collaborated with in the project so far. One little focus I want to just spend a little bit of time in is the location, so drumming in the heat. So often we know that the drummers perform either indoor venues, so this is Block Party at the Brighton Centre a few years ago, or we can go outdoors where it can be very hot, humid or hot, dry conditions. So we know that the location of the various environments may induce a stress that we need to be aware of. So back, Pascale, to your question about the jazz drummers or drummers previously, Gene Krupa back in 1950, if you look at the jacket that he's wearing, absolutely drenched in sweat. And we know that sweating comes from physical activity, whereby when we're exercising, we increase our heat storage. We generate heat when the muscles contract. And therefore, one of the ways in which the body removes that heat from the core is to make us sweat. Hence the middle image that you can see. If you see the image of Clem in 2011, again up at Liverpool, you can see him wringing out his T-shirt because it's just sodden with water, with sweat. So we know that the thermal load of drumming, potentially combined with the location, if it's a hot, humid environment, that could be problematic, because if we lose water at a rate that we don't put it back in, as I mentioned before, then that's going to cause problems in terms of fatigue. So I'm not going to spend too long unpicking this, other than to say, if we look at the title, it's all about our ability to maintain a core temperature. So as you're sitting here now, listening to this particular session, you've probably got a core temperature around about 37.5 degrees. If we begin to exercise, that generates heat, and that causes a particular issue. If we look at the red box where it's got air temperature, if we exercise in the heat, we know that we're going to get hotter. And if we look at the bottom red box, what can impair evaporation, the yellow box above it, our ability to lose heat, is if the air is already saturated with water, which is where we have a high humidity. So the worst case scenario potentially for a drummer is to be performing a very dynamic set with a high air temperature, with a high relative humidity. And I'll show you an example whereby the consequences of that can be quite profound. So this is a case study of Jamie Oliver, who at the time was the drummer with the punk rock band UK Subs. So Jamie's details are there, typical sort of guy. But interestingly, the 100 Club at London is an iconic venue whereby you go down the stairs to the venue. There is no natural airflow. It is a very snug, very hot, very humid environment. And so ideal for us to take this particular measurements. Because we were interested in looking at the internal temperature of the room, we were able to capture that by looking at the temperature and humidity. We were also really interested to look at the core temperature of Jamie. So we got him to swallow a pill which transmitted his core temperature. If you can imagine a big paracetamol size sort of pill, in that pill was a transmitter that once it settled in his stomach, it transmitted how hot he was to a receiver outside of his body. He would naturally get rid of that pill the next time he went to the toilet. We measured his body mass before and after to look at the sweat rate, and we looked at heart rate again every 5 seconds during the gig. So the concert lasted 62 minutes, so just about an hour, 22 songs. The air temperature ranged between 25 to 34 degrees, with relative humidity between 68 to 84%. So we've got a lot of songs, very hot, very humid. And the consequences for that is that when Jamie was playing, the blood that would pass through the brain, which is sort of the middle image, signals to the brain, I'm overheating. It kicks into operation these mechanisms to try and lose heat. One of those is to sweat. And you can see the picture on the right that Jamie is just, again, full of sweat in terms of his body trying to have lost that heat. And if you look at the data at the bottom, within that 1 hour, Jamie's lost 2.6% of his body mass, which is like 2 liters per hour of fluid. So if you think next time you go for a drink, just put 2 liters of fluid in front of you. That's how much he's leaking from the system, if you want to put it that way. And if you would continue to do that quite quickly, your brain would tell you you've got to stop, and fatigue would kick in and the performance would stop. So again, that sort of data collection is really, really interesting for us, because if you then look at his heart rate for that 1 hour, his heart rate averaged 195 beats per minute with a peak of 208 beats per minute. That's just phenomenal in terms of what the heart is having to do to maintain that performance. And what you can also see, unlike Clem's and the footballer's heart rate, there's not much of a reduction in between the songs. And the reason for that is UK Subs, as a punk rock band, there are no guitar solos. There are no interaction with the crowd. It's song after song after song, these 3-minute hits, these 3-minute versions of the songs. There is no time to recover. It's one after the other. There's 22 songs that were played. So again, understanding that requirement for Jamie was fascinating. I presented this data in Estoril abroad, and physiologists were a bit snubby about, oh, what's drumming, what's so demanding. I put this one slide up and it was like, oh my gosh, that's hard work. So interesting. If we then, from looking at the increase in Jamie's core temperature, you can see the rise from, again, around about 37.5 to up to 39 degrees, just over at 41 minutes. So within 41 minutes, his core temperature has increased by 1.5 degrees. And what that's demonstrating to us is there's an inefficiency of him trying to lose that temperature to the environment. If anything, the environment's almost adding more to that increase in core temperature. And it's not until he started to ingest some water that began to moderate that increase. So again, really, really interesting that if we don't have an intervention that helps us cope with the environment, that's going to be problematic. And so with Mark Richardson, we were able to simulate that in the lab. So we said to Mark, download your Skunk Anansi playlist. Let's take you into a chamber. Let's set it for an hour at 32 degrees and 69% relative humidity. So we replicated what was happening in the 100 Club. And you can see that at the beginning, Mark's quite perky and happy. During it, there's more of a focus, and at the end, it's absolutely shattered. And what we can see again from the results is a peak heart rate of 183 beats per minute, a really high blood lactate value because of the intensity of some of the Skunk Anansi songs, and a sweat rate again approaching 2% body weight. So again, if you're not prepared for that, it's going to come at a cost. And again, that's where the science potentially can help out a little bit in allowing the musician to recognize what's coming, what are the threats to performance, and therefore we can do things prior to that to minimize the effect. So just this last part specifically with the drumming, and then I'll get on to sort of the research side. So touring is a fascinating area for me. I love chatting to drummers about how they survive being on the road. And this is some data we collected with Mark in 2022, just after COVID had sort of finished and bands were getting back on the road. And so we've got a period of June, July 2022, sort of a European tour that Skunk went on. And so we've got the months of June and July with the specific dates and then the destinations. But interestingly, then we have the distance and the number of hours that the band are traveling for. So that first beginning of being 40 hours on a coach to get to the various places, and thereafter, as we move our way down, the number of hours towards the end where you're doing 10 hours, 19 hours. You know, this is the unseen demands, especially when you're on a bus tracking around Europe. Regardless of the challenges of actually playing the gig, you've actually got to survive being on the road. And so again, you wouldn't get professional sports people putting themselves through this. So again, there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of understanding the best advice to offer the traveling musician. And we're working on a book that potentially will pull all of these observations together and offer some advice. But for me, just looking at that is just so demanding. And, you know, there are others, I'm sure, which are more extreme than this. But, you know, if I was to say to you, you've got to travel for 10 hours or 19 hours and then perform at your best, that's not the ideal prep that you would suggest to somebody. So again, understanding the context before you actually get to sit before the kit is interesting. And again, this is Mark just showing the setup. This is at Southampton in England, in the UK. Again, the blue line denotes the period before the show. Again, a heart rate of around about 55, 60 beats per minute, signifying a fit guy. You then got the gig, and you see the ups and downs. And then you have 38 minutes post-recovery, and you can see that it doesn't fall back the line to what it was before the show. And this is still the body looking to recover in terms of the thermal load, etc., removing heat, perhaps having something to eat that keeps that elevated. So again, by understanding the full process allows us to make better decisions, especially with refueling and putting fluid back into the system. And so because we know with Mark, he could lose up to 2% of his body weight, this is where science potentially does have a role to play. So fluid replacement within sport, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. Most of us potentially might have tried a sports drink at some point. What this image is trying to say is that we collected data with Mark. We demonstrated with Mark that if you don't put fluid back in the system, fatigue will ensue and potentially you might collapse at the kit. And so we can see at the beginning of the show, Mark's preparing all of his fluids with electrolytes and other energy. So he's making his own drinks up that are bespoke to him. During the gig itself, he's recognizing he's got to replace that fluid. And importantly, at the end, he knows what to drink during those first half an hour or so before the meet and greet all arrives with management and fans and all the rest of that. There are things he has to do or is advised to do that will help him recover quicker. And we've learned those.
It's not simply water. What does he put in the drinks? I want a recipe.
So within that are electrolytes like sodium and potassium. So when we sweat, if you've ever sweated and let it dry and then you lick your lips, sometimes you get a salty taste. Then that's the electrolytes that are being lost in the water as well. So when we sweat, it's not just water that goes, it's electrolytes as well. So again, sports drinks, if you pick up any sports drink and look at the labeling, you'll see that they'll have sodium and potassium in that particular mix, because if you add those in, it helps the body retain the fluid quicker than water alone. So by just drinking pure water isn't potentially optimum at the speed at which you can put fluid back into the system. So again, how much energy you put, how much carbohydrate you add in to the drink will be dictated by whether your priority is to put fluid in with the electrolytes, or if you want to put energy in, then you add carbohydrate. And so most sports drinks claim to give you energy because they'll have carbohydrate in it, and claim to rehydrate because they'll have electrolytes in it. But depending upon what the biggest threat is, you can manipulate how you make those up, and that's where it becomes bespoke to those drummers that we work with. But the concept is there is something that we can do. We shouldn't be ignorant that we don't know what to do. And that's what part of the messaging is for the drummers that we work with, is we have an understanding of what the challenge lies ahead. And if you're going to play somewhere hot and humid or hot and dry, you have to have a strategy in place to allow you to perform during the gig and to recover in between those gigs. But imagine that this lecture was to finish at 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, and then I've got everybody coming in to visit me, and then I'm jumping on a coach, and I'm traveling overnight, and I'm doing it again. When do you drink? When do you eat? When do you recover? So it's a really challenging environment that for a scientist, it's awesome because there's so many questions that you're observing that you want to find questions or answers to. So that's just a real indication of the appliance of science with that.